June 27, 1944, outside Saint-Lô, Normandy. The summer air was thick with the smell of wet soil, cordite, and diesel. Rain had turned the narrow French roads into a patchwork of mud and shattered stone. In a shallow valley, hidden between the hedgerows, a group of German Panzer Grenadiers lounged beside their machines, the pride of Hitler's armored corps, a pair of Panzer Riveters, and a single Panther tank, its long 75mm gun pointed lazily toward the horizon. Oberleutnant Karl Reiner leaned against the turret, a cigarette hanging from his lips. He was only 26 but already wore the Iron Cross on his chest. His men trusted his aim more than any compass. As he wiped grime from his binoculars, a corporal nearby chuckled, tossing a mangled piece of metal between his hands, a fragment of armor plating taken from an American M4 Sherman. "Look at this," the corporal laughed. "You could punch a hole through it with a screwdriver." The others joined in. To them, the Sherman was a joke, a boxy, underpowered toy rolling off American assembly lines by the thousands. A tank built by amateurs for soldiers who didn't understand war. Karl smiled faintly, but said nothing. He'd seen the Shermans before, burning wrecks usually, scattered across hedgerows like tin cans. Their armor, barely 2 inches thick in places, could be pierced at 800 meters by a Panzer IV and from over a kilometer by his Panther. The Americans were brave, maybe, but their tanks? Pathetic. Still, as he raised his binoculars, scanning the fields beyond the hedgerows, a small part of him wondered why there were so many of them. Across the valley, the low hum of engines broke the morning calm. The sound grew, a vibration that made the ground tremble. The Germans froze, listening. It wasn't a single tank, it was dozens, maybe more. "Shermans," muttered one of the crewmen, pressing an ear to the turret. Karl climbed inside the Panther, the metallic clang echoing through the compartment. The loader checked shells, stacking armor-piercing rounds near the breech. The gunner adjusted his sights, whispering to himself. The laughter from minutes ago vanished. Over the ridge, olive-drab shapes began to emerge. First the barrels, then the hulls. American tanks moving in formation. Each one kicked up mud and smoke as they advanced through the fields, supported by infantry crawling along the hedgerows. Their engines roared like a swarm of metal insects, synchronized, relentless. "Fools," Karl said quietly. "They're driving straight into our line." He leaned closer to the gunner. "Wait until they cross the road. The first one, make it count." The Panther's gun recoiled with a thunderous crack. The shell flew across the valley, slamming into the lead Sherman. Fire blossomed from the hull as its turret popped open like a kettle lid. The German crew erupted in cheers. Then another shot, another kill. 2 Shermans burned, a third reversed into a ditch. Smoke rolled across the hedgerows as American infantry scattered for cover. It was exactly what the Germans had expected. Another easy ambush. But something was different this time. The Shermans didn't retreat. A radio crackled inside Karl's turret. The voice of a fellow tank commander came through, tense. "They're calling artillery. Pull back." Before Karl could respond, the ground around the Panther exploded. Dirt and metal fragments rained down. Allied artillery had found their position. The valley that had once felt so safe now became a death trap. From the sky came the distant whine of aircraft engines, American P-47 Thunderbolts circling like hawks. Moments later, bombs screamed downward, obliterating a German gun emplacement. The Panzer IV to Karl's left vanished in a bloom of orange fire. He shouted for his driver to reverse. The Panther lurched backward, treads grinding against mud, but it was too late. Through the smoke, the remaining Shermans pressed forward, guns blazing. One of them, its armor blackened but still rolling, closed the distance. Its 75mm shell slammed into the Panther's side, denting but not piercing. Another hit followed, then another. The armor held, but Karl could feel the tide shifting. This wasn't just a skirmish, it was a storm, and the Shermans were everywhere. For the first time, Karl realized the truth his laughter had hidden. The Americans didn't need thicker armor. They had something far deadlier: numbers, fuel, and the sky itself. The battle for Normandy was only beginning. The hedgerows around Saint-Lô were burning now, thick, greasy smoke twisting up from shattered trees and scorched wheat. The quiet valley where Karl Reiner's crew had mocked the matchbox Shermans was gone, replaced by thunder. Engines, bombs, guns. The earth itself seemed to shudder beneath it all. Inside the Panther, the air was suffocating, a mix of hot oil and gunpowder. The loader, Hans, wiped sweat from his forehead as he rammed another shell into the breach. "Ready!" he shouted, but his voice was drowned by the rising roar outside. Through his periscope, Carl could see the impossible. Dozens of Shermans advancing in a wide arc, their turrets turning in unison. Each machine had infantry in tow. GIs crouched low, moving from ditch to ditch with practiced coordination. Behind them, the American artillery never stopped. Each explosion threw columns of dirt skyward, keeping the German tanks blind and pinned. The Sherman may have been weaker, Carl thought, but it never fought alone. "Traverse left, 2 o'clock, Carl barked. The gunner swung the turret, tracking a Sherman cresting the ridge. The German cannon fired, the round hit, but the tank kept moving, smoke spilling from the impact but not stopping. Another fired from the right. This one missed. The Americans' return fire was immediate. A shell slammed into the Panther's mantlet, shaking the entire tank like a bell. Metal splinters rained across the crew compartment. The radio operator screamed, blood running down his face from a jagged gash. "Driver, reverse!" Carl shouted. "I can't!" Tracks jammed. The realization hit like ice water. They were stuck. Outside, one of the remaining Panzer IVs tried to reposition, only to be struck from above by a rocket. A thunderbolt swooped low, strafing the field with .50 caliber fire, cutting down soldiers as they tried to flee. Carl's eyes darted upward. A formation of the fighter bombers was circling again, black crosses painted on their wings. Not the Luftwaffes, though. White stars. American. Dozens of them. For months, German propaganda had promised air superiority. But here, above St. Lo, the only planes in the sky wore enemy colors. The second wave of Shermans began to push through the hedgerows. Their commanders shouted from open turrets, guiding infantry with hand signals. They weren't advancing recklessly now. They were hunting. Carl knew then that the old rules no longer applied. The era of the lone, superior German tank was ending. The war had become one of factories, fuel, and coordination. A war the Allies were built to win. "Load, high explosive," Carl said grimly. If he couldn't win, he'd at least make them pay for every meter. The gun fired again, the recoil jarring through his shoulders. A Sherman exploded, finally, its turret lifting clear off in a ball of orange flame. The crew inside never had a chance. For a moment, Carl allowed himself to breathe. Then, from the smoke, 5 more came. They didn't stop. They didn't hesitate. And in that moment, staring through the narrow slit of his gun sight, Carl felt something he'd never felt on any battlefield before. Not pride, not fury, but insignificance. The Americans had turned war into production. Each tank he destroyed seemed instantly replaced. His world, the world of the elite Panzer Ace, was being buried under waves of steel and fire. He turned to his crew, voice low but steady. "Prepare to abandon. We can't hold this line outside." The fields of Normandy trembled as hundreds of Shermans rolled forward. Not fast, not elegant, but unstoppable. And as Carl opened the hatch and climbed out into the choking smoke, he finally understood why the Allies didn't need thicker armor. They had momentum. The fields of Normandy had become a furnace. As Carl Reiner and his crew scrambled from their crippled Panther, the world was all thunder and smoke. The air was hot enough to sting their skin, heavy with the acrid taste of cordite and burned rubber. Every breath hurt, every second stretched into eternity. Behind them, the Panther sat at an awkward angle, one tread half buried in the mud, its engine still whining helplessly. The jam track had sealed its fate. Carl turned once to look at it, that dark steel beast that had once made him feel invincible, and then turned away. It was a tomb now. "Into the ditch!" he shouted. They dove for cover as another artillery barrage crashed down, exploding across the ridge where the German line had once stood. The earth lifted under them. Dirt rained from the sky. When the shelling stopped, only the faint rumble of tank engines remained. The Shermans were closing in, methodically sweeping the valley. Through the haze, Carl saw movement, not one tank but a column. 30, maybe 40 Shermans, advancing in staggered formation. Their hulls were scarred and blackened, but their coordination was flawless. Infantry followed in their wake, rifles at the ready, calm, disciplined. A young German grenadier beside Karl raised his Panzerfaust, hands trembling. Karl grabbed his arm. "Wait for them to come closer," he whispered. "Don't waste it." But it was no use. The boy fired too early. The rocket whooshed through the smoke, missing by meters. In an instant, 3 Shermans turned their turrets toward the flash. A roar. The grenadier vanished in a cloud of dirt and fire. Karl clenched his teeth. The Americans were fighting like a machine, not a collection of soldiers, but a single, grinding organism. Tanks, infantry, aircraft, artillery, every piece moved in concert. By contrast, his own battalion was in chaos. Radios were dead. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. Every road behind them was jammed with wrecks and retreating troops. This wasn't the war he'd been trained for, the swift, decisive blitzkrieg of 1940. This was something colder, more methodical. This was industrial war. The ground shook again as the Shermans pressed forward. Karl crawled through the ditch, dragging his wounded radio operator by the collar. A bullet snapped past his ear. He ducked low, pulling the man into a crater. "Hold on," Karl muttered, ripping a strip from his sleeve to bandage the wound. "We'll fall back to the tree line." The radio man's eyes fluttered. "Lieutenant, where's the Luftwaffe?" Karl looked up. The sky was empty, except for contrails of American fighters. He said nothing. A distant whistle pierced the air. Artillery again. The next barrage slammed into the far end of the valley. Not random, but precise. Karl realized they were being herded. The Americans were cutting off every escape. He pressed his face into the dirt as another shell hit close, showering them with mud. His ears rang. When the ringing faded, he heard it. The mechanical growl of treads grinding over soil closer and closer. A Sherman loomed over the ridge, its hull blackened, its guns slowly rotating. Karl froze. He could see the white star on its side, half covered in soot. The tank stopped, its commander peering out from the open hatch. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. 2 men from opposite worlds, staring through smoke and ruin. The American raised his hand. The turret turned. Karl pulled the wounded man tighter against him, bracing for the end. But instead of fire, there was a pause. The Sherman's gun elevated slightly, then moved on, rolling past without shooting. Karl exhaled slowly. Maybe the American had mistaken them for corpses, or maybe he simply didn't care. The battle was already won. As the tank disappeared into the haze, Karl watched the line of Shermans continue forward, endless and unstoppable. He realized then that it wasn't the Panther's thick armor or the Tiger's fearsome gun that had once made Germany's army strong. It was belief. Belief that they were invincible. And that belief was now gone. Behind the roar of the advancing tanks, he could already hear distant cheering. Not German voices, but American. The laughter had returned to the battlefield. Only now it wasn't theirs. The sound of American engines faded into the distance, replaced by the faint crackle of burning fields. Karl Reiner lay in the dirt, motionless, the world reduced to gray ash and silence. The once proud armored line of the Wehrmacht had been shattered, not by superior tanks, but by relentless momentum. Hours passed before he dared to move. Smoke still hung over the valley, thick as fog. Around him lay the twisted remains of panzers, their guns bent skyward like dead branches. The proud black crosses painted on their sides were now smeared with soot and blood. Hans, his loader, crawled out from a collapsed hedgerow, his uniform burned at the sleeves. His face was blank, not fear, not anger, just disbelief. "We were supposed to hold St. Lo," he murmured, staring at the horizon. "They said reinforcements would come." Karl didn't answer. He knew reinforcements wouldn't come. The panzers were fuel-starved, the Luftwaffe grounded, and the front collapsing faster than anyone dared to admit. Every promise from Berlin was smoke. The 2 men began to move toward the woods, stepping over craters and the bodies of fallen comrades. Some of the dead still clutched their Panzerfausts, faces frozen in grim defiance. Others lay twisted beside burned-out half-tracks, remnants of a force that once believed itself unstoppable. They reached the tree line and found a shallow stream running through the underbrush. The cool water bit at their skin as they knelt to drink. For the first time in days, Karl could think clearly. He looked back toward the valley. The Shermans were dots now, crawling deeper into France, their columns stretching beyond sight. Above them, American planes drifted lazily, unchallenged. It was no longer a battle. It was a procession. Hans broke the silence. They used to say our tanks were the best in the world. Tigers, Panthers. Now look, Carl nodded slowly. They were the best. But the Americans learned faster than anyone expected. They didn't build tanks to duel. They built them to win wars. He remembered the laughter that morning, the jokes about thin armor, about matchbox tanks. He felt sick. The truth had arrived on a wave of steel and fire. The Sherman wasn't a symbol of weakness. It was a symbol of willpower, of an industrial machine that could lose 100 tanks and send 200 more by morning. By dusk, they found what was left of their company, a handful of exhausted men huddled in a barn, their uniforms stained with mud and defeat. One of them, a sergeant, recognized Carl and saluted weakly. "Lieutenant Reiner," he said, "Command wants us to regroup at the Orne River. They say we can still push them back." Carl looked around. There were 6 of them. No radio, no fuel, no hope. He almost laughed. Instead, he sat down on an overturned crate and stared at his hands, cracked, blackened from smoke. "The war's already decided," he said quietly. "We just haven't been told yet." Outside, the sky was glowing orange from the fires still burning along the horizon. The smell of diesel hung heavy in the air. Every now and then, a distant explosion rolled across the countryside, the echo of an empire breaking apart. Hans joined him in silence. The others slept where they sat, too tired to dream. In the distance, the faint hum of engines rose again. Not German, but American. Always American. Carl leaned back against the barn wall and closed his eyes. He could still see them, those olive-green shapes rolling endlessly through the smoke. The tanks he once mocked had become the sound of inevitability. Somewhere beyond the hills, men cheered. Flags were raised, bridges rebuilt. The tide of war had turned for good. And in the dark, Carl whispered to no one, "They laughed at our tanks once too." He let out a long breath, the smell of ash still in his lungs. The laughter was over. The lesson remained.